So this Darlington local plan examination hearing session is now open. I think probably all of you know that I'm William Fieldhouse, the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the Darlington local plan. Like all the other sessions, this will take the form of a structured discussion of the matters set out on the agenda. I just need to run quickly through a few procedural introductory matters, but I think, as I was saying, you're all familiar with these now. Just a reminder, please, if you could leave your cameras turned off and your microphones turned off, at least after we've done introductions, and then just turn them on when I ask you to speak. There were a bit of connectivity problems that at least I had this morning. Towards the end of the session, I was able to hear everything, but I couldn't. My camera seemed to have frozen in terms of what I saw, and the raise hand icon was not appearing on my screen, so that made things a bit difficult. But having less cameras turned on apparently makes that less likely to be a problem. Just to say, if I do have such problems again or worse problems, it's possible I may have to adjourn and go out, leave the meeting, join again and see if that works. But anyway, hopefully it won't arise. It's generally been okay, the technology. Participants are listed on the agenda, but I'll just go through the list if I could, please, just so everyone can introduce themselves so we can clarify who's participating this afternoon. So we're going to start with the council and David Hand.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. David Hand, Head of Planning Policy, Economic Strategy and Environment, representing Darlington Borough Council. And
David Nelson.
Hello, sir. David Nelson, Principal Planning Policy Officer within the policy team representing the council.
And Fiona McCall.
Hi, sir. Yes, Fiona McCall, Planning Policy Officer representing the council.
And Matthew Usher.
Afternoon, sir. Matthew Usher, Planning Officer at Darlington Borough Council.
Okay, is that everyone representing the council this afternoon? Yep, I assume it is. Right, Ken Madison.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. Ken Madison, representing myself, probably a lonely resident.
Okay, good afternoon. Ross, for Darlington Green Party, we got Ross Chisholm.
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, Ross Chisholm here. I've been supplying information on housing supply generally and Windfalls in particular to CPRE and more recently to the Darlington Green Party. Okay,
thank you. And also for the Green Party, Councillor Holroyd.
Hello, yes, Bryony Holroyd for Darlington Green Party.
Welcome back. Anyone else from the Green Party?
Yes, Councillor Matthew Snedke is here as well. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back to you too. Richard Cohen.
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, as Ross has indicated, I'm here for CPR.
And for the Green Party,
I'm anticipating Ross will actually be doing quite a lot of talking on our behalf this afternoon.
So, sorry, Mr. Cohen, it's a bit hard to hear you. I don't know if there's something you might say.
Sorry, sir.
That's better.
I'm here for a CPRE. There's also Bird Club and Cycling Interests if they arise. As Mr. Chisholm has indicated, he has done quite a lot of work in respect to this afternoon session, so I'm anticipating he may be doing a lot of speaking this afternoon.
Okay. John Harding, HBF.
Thank you. Yes, I'm here, sir. It's John Harding on behalf of the Home Builders Federation.
Okay, welcome back to you too. James Hall.
Afternoon, sir. James Hall for Bellway Homes.
And Ben Stevenson. No. Stephen Litherland.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good afternoon, sir. Stephen Litherland from Headley, representing Miller Homes.
Your microphone's breaking up a bit.
I'll try and fix that, sir. I'll try and fix it.
Okay, thanks. Stephen Longstaff.
Thank you, sir. Stephen Longstaff from ELG Planning, acting for Taylor Wimpey.
Okay, Tom Baker.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Tom Baker of Savills, representing Story Homes this afternoon.
Martin Bonner of Savills.
Good afternoon, sir. Martin Bonner, Savills, representing Helen's Land and Homes England.
Jennifer Longstaff.
Afternoon, everyone. Jennifer Longstaff from Savills, representing Bussey and Armstrong Projects Limited.
Okay, Joe Ridgeon.
Afternoon, sir. Joe Ridgeon from Headley Planning, representing Gary Restrick.
Afternoon. Who have we got for representing Skirningham Estates?
Afternoon, sir. It is Neil Westbrook this time, representing Skirningham Estates Limited.
Okay. Anyone else from representing Skirningham this afternoon?
No, just myself this afternoon, sir.
Okay. Presumably you've been briefed on the the resumption that we're having of the discussion about Skirningham tomorrow afternoon.
Yes, sir. I was watching separately. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. Right. Richard Agnew for Gladman Developments.
Good afternoon, sir. Yeah, Richard Agnew representing Gladman Developments.
Afternoon. Rachel Flounders.
Afternoon, sir. Rachel Flounders from ID Planning, acting on behalf of Hallam Land Management.
Afternoon. Musa Chowdhury.
Good afternoon, sir. Musa Chowdhury from Barton Wilmore, representing the Church Commissioners for England.
Afternoon. Andrew Moss.
Afternoon, sir. Andrew Moss from Ward Heatherway, representing Nigel Swinbank.
And James Seabury.
Good afternoon, sir. James Seabury, representing the Banks Group.
Okay. Just Mr. Cohen, actually, you've left your camera on. I don't know if you're
my apologies.
We feel we're intruding into your home. We're the only one on the screen somewhat. Right, okay, thank you all. Is there anyone else that's intending or hoping to participate this afternoon that hasn't introduced themselves and I've missed off the list? No, okay, good. Well, you've all participated before, so I won't go through all the usual opening remarks. Just a reminder, please, about emission sites. I know some of you are promoting emission sites, and this could be part of the hearing that you might have thought this is an opportunity to get them in, but that's not my role, as you're aware, so we'll try and resist that. So we've got this afternoon to deal with the various items on the agenda. I think there's one thing I've probably missed off the agenda, which is only it's small sites and custom and self-build, which were my questions 4.22 and 4.23. So I'll deal with that as well as the other items on the agenda. I'll do that at the end, I think. That was just an omission from my part. So just before we start on the first agenda item, I thought I might just go back. I've had a chance over the slightly extended lunch break to go through the action points from this morning. I thought it might just be helpful to clarify what those are. I will put them in writing at some point. But if the council just sort of, I'll go through this and you can let me know if it tallies with your list and if I've forgotten anything else. So first of all, there was about the modifying policy H2 and possibly other parts of the plan to remove references to certain allocations being strategic and others being non-strategic. There's the development requirements for Elm Tree Farm. B, I'm not going to go through the detail, but the council to think about how these should be modified, bearing the discussion that we had and the steers I gave earlier. Criteria B relating to farm buildings, retaining the farm buildings. C relating to the Green Lane. D about landscape sensitivity, and part F and probably the introductory part of the development requirements referring to the Skirningham master plan. Blackwell Grange is the policies map, to reconsider the extent of the green wedge designation. One, should a housing allocation also be designated as green wedge? Isn't there a sort of confusion that causes given the wording of ENV3? And secondly, whether the boundary of the green wedge to the north of the housing allocation, i.e. around the hotel, is justified, and whether it should extend actually just to cover all of the open land there, so that it goes up in effect to the same the line that defines the parkland and the physical boundary with the development that lies to the west and north. So that's the policies map designation there. And I think there's also an issue about the wording of parts D and F, which are both to do with biodiversity or ecology. One's to do with, refers to biodiversity habitat on the site and mitigation, and the other one refers to great crested newts in the area and the requirement for an ecological study. So I think those two ought to be combined. And I think you just need to rethink the wording, bearing in mind what Mr. Nelson said earlier about the information that actually exists about the biodiversity on the site. I think, I mean, I'm not saying there shouldn't be an ecological study. That may be about all it does say. But anyway, mitigation being provided on adjoining land may be something the council wishes to say. I mean, it's the council's land, so presumably that's an achievable policy. Anyway, I'll leave you to think about that. Connors Cliff Park South, I've got a note of a development requirement relating to the western boundary with the adjoining local green space and what's required in terms of landscaping there. But also there's another section of the southern site that has a boundary with the countryside, which again, I guess, would need a similar requirement to the requirement for the Connors Cliff Park North, which does talk about creating a landscaped edge to the settlement, so the interface with the adjoining countryside. Similarly, I mean, Mr. Hand, I think, said he didn't think this was necessary, but I think for completeness and for consistency and effectiveness, a similar development requirement ought to be applied to the Middleton St George allocation. Again, the western boundary, as I think was confirmed with Mr. Baker this morning, the scheme that's being put forward does provide landscaping around that to create again a landscaped edge to between the housing and the countryside beyond. The Great Burden Green Wedge Rural Gap, I asked the council to prepare a plan and a short note showing a potentially revised edge to the Green Wedge and the Rural Gap based on what's in the statement of common ground, not because of the housing allocation, but because of what's necessary and what's logical in landscape terms, where a new boundary could most sensibly be created to define that green edge and rural gap potentially. Anyway, that would be something we could discuss again at policy, under policy ENV3 next week. Any questions, comments about that from the council or anyone else if they feel I've missed something? No.
Just come on and say, yeah, that's a fair representation of the action points we had down as well. So you've covered everything. Good.
Okay. In terms of it's just I'm not going to provide a great deal more clarity, but yesterday there was an action point that was the council was to have a discussion, I think, with the two of the site promoters for Skirningham and to think about, there was various discussions we had about what infrastructure was needed at what times during the development in terms of the amount of housing that's going to be coming forward in a sort of phased way. The whole issue of it's not phasing in the sense of restricting, but some indication possibly in the plan of the way in which the site's likely to be developed over a long period of time, including up to 2036, but well beyond that as well. So something about that, something about how the timing of that and where bits of development would take place and the infrastructure that goes with them to support it in a timely way, and something potentially that I think Mr. Harrison talked about, the issue the slight issue I'd identified in terms of the transport modelling didn't actually assess the impacts of 4,500 homes. So in some sense, it's hard to know what the extent and the nature of the mitigation that might be required to accommodate that amount of development. So there may be something about a review mechanism, I think Mr. Harrison referred to as a potential tool that could be used to not necessarily to reduce the scale of the proposal in the plan, but to link some of it at least to some sort of review mechanism to ensure, well, I suppose a number of things. One, about the way that the development's been taking place through the plan period and has arisen so far. And also about what would have to be brought forward through a review of the plan in terms of additional mitigation. So I won't give any more of a steer. I don't know if that in hand, that's going to work. I know most of you are involved here today, so it's probably a bit difficult, but it would be helpful to have something to discuss tomorrow afternoon if possible. On reflection, is that likely to be possible?
It is, yes. We've already had discussions on it this morning, and we've got a draft that we hopefully will have finalised for you by the end of this session. So when you finish with this, I'm sure it'll be with you for
to read over the football at 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if anyone's Welsh here, but I think Wales are playing at 5 o'clock, aren't they? So we need to finish properly on their behalf anyway. Okay. As I said yesterday, I mean, it's a short time period in which to prepare something, and I wouldn't expect it necessarily to be finalised either from your point of view or necessarily the other parties involved in drafting it. And also, obviously, I want to discuss it, and others people will have quite an opportunity to have a say about that. So, but that's helpful to have something so people can look at before we get into the discussion. And just a reminder, really, for those that will be involved again in the Skirningham discussion, I'm not going to going back over the same issues again that we've already dealt with. We'll take that as, you know, that's been discussed. There are a few loose ends that I might want to pick up on, and I think the council may want to come back on some of the things, because I didn't give the council an opportunity at the end to sort of to respond to everything that's been said. There is the issue about the trajectory of the site and the 5-year housing requirement that was on my list of things to discuss that we didn't deal with at all yesterday, but we will deal with that, and that kind of links in with what we're talking about in terms of phasing and etc. So that's just a broad outline of the Skirningham, of the nature of the Skirningham discussion tomorrow. Just I thought that might be helpful to clarify for people. Right, any procedural questions before we start on the agenda from anyone? I think I've just had a note. Mr. Stevenson, who I read his name out earlier, from representing Persimmon Homes. Are you there now, Mr. Stevenson? Yeah, do you want to just briefly?
Hi there. Yes, sorry about that.
Okay.
There was an error on my side. I was sat waiting in the wrong Teams link. So I'm Ben Stevenson. I'm a planner from Persimmon Homes Teesside.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to you. You've missed the introduction, but I assume that you're aware of how we operate in these sessions, and you've read the guidance notes, etc. So hopefully that's not a disadvantage to you. Yes. Okay. Thank you for confirming that. Right.
Thanks.
Okay. So the first thing I just wanted to check was we talked about some of the individual housing allocations. We're dealing with the mixed-use Greater Favordale allocation next week. We've got further discussion about Skirningham. We've talked about some of the other allocations today. I just wanted to make 3 of the allocations now, with the council's update to the housing supply situation, are now categorised as commitments. So that's the Hall Farm, Allington Way, and no, wrong ones. Bertree Lane, Berrymead Farm, and Allington Way are now commitments. So I don't want to talk about those now. We may as well deal with that under the commitments item on the agenda. But there's still a number of other allocations that I'll just give you the opportunity now if there's anything anybody wishes to say about any of those. So these are the allocations listed in policy 6.3 of the plan that we haven't already discussed. Either by way of information about promoting them or concerns about their deliverability or developability. No, okay, fine. Right, so that's that. In which case, let's now look at the purpose of this afternoon is for me to get a full understanding of the overall housing supply situation for the planned period, as well as the 5-year supply now and then as we look forward. So we've talked about allocations. I just want to finish off with the allocations and about the contributions that those are assumed to make over the planned period. That doesn't seem to be disputed in the sense that I've given the opportunity to mention any more now. The one that there's a number that are expected to make a contribution to the 5-year supply, and they're listed in the council's updated response to SQ 6.2. So they're in the table at the top of page 6, and we've talked, some of them we've talked about, some of them we haven't. Most of them are fairly modest in size, and they fall into the under 30 or so, aren't they? Apart from Snipe Lane at Herworth Moor. So the council says it's got clear evidence that will deliver 2 240 dwellings within the next 5 years. It's a 35 hectare site. It's in a high value area. It's got planning permission now. Presumably that's post 1st of April this year. With detailed permission for 305. The council own the site. We're building affordable homes as the joint venture developer partner, and the council anticipating a start on site imminently. So, anything the council wishes to say about Snipe Lane, and is anything that anybody wishes to query about the assumption that that will deliver 240, or indeed any of the other allocations will deliver what the council say they will between 2021 and 2026? Can you recall?
I say, yeah, just to confirm that at Snipe Lane they are on site now and groundworks are being undertaken for preparation of the site. Just to confirm.
Okay. When you said in the statement, I think that the council on the site will be building affordable homes. Does that mean they're all affordable homes, or it's a mixture of affordable and market homes?
I think it's going to be a mixture on the site, so it's a hybrid application, but and there's a development partner on board with that site as well. I believe it's Esh Homes, so the council will be building an affordable element there, but 65% affordable, and Esh Homes will be building the market element of the scheme.
65% of the houses will be affordable?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Okay. Right. Okay. And the 200, what did I say it was? 240 in 5 years. So that's 60. Is that right? Yeah.
Sorry, just bear with me, sir.
First completion in 2022, 23. So 60 a year. So it's 2 outlets, is it, presumably?
Yes, we're looking at 60 a year from 2022 to 23.
Yeah.
That's based on the 2 developers with the higher rate of delivery, yes.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay. Thank you. If anyone's got any queries about that, Mr. Madison.
Hear me? Hello, can you hear me now?
I can, yeah.
Yes, there is a site that I don't know if it should be on or is completely missing, and it's called Northgate House. There's been a planning application put in for it in Darlington for 105 units, which to me sounds like a very good move. It's an existing building that was an office block, and they're talking about transferring it obviously over to lower cost housing close to the town centre. It's been turned down, 105 houses, 105 units.
Okay. I just want to, I'll come on to, well, I'm dealing with the list of sites that are in policy H2 at the moment.
Yes, I appreciate that, and I do apologise.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll get the council to clarify that. But Mr. Chisholm, sorry, any comments on the housing allocations listed in policy H2 that you want to comment on?
Yes, I have 2 questions or points to make about commitments, not just up to 2025, but to the end of the planned period. Will you be covering that later, or can I mention that now?
I'm going to be dealing with commitments shortly. I'm just dealing with the allocations that haven't got planning permission at the moment.
Yeah, I would just like the council, if they could just clarify the situation at Snipe Lane, where 450 are commitments, because I'm leaving 250 on a smaller site remaining as the allocation.
Right. The plan allocates.
I'm a bit confused because the council is still saying it's a 700 dwelling allocation on.
I'll do it. Sorry.
On site 410, when in fact the allocation boundary is smaller now and is only 250, whereas 450 on most of the site has got planning permission, as was just pointed out. Development has started.
Okay, right. So the allocation, you're quite right. In table 6.3, there's an allocation at Snipe Lane. It's site reference 410. It's nearly 35 hectares, and the indicative yield is 700. So just want to just clarify, Mr. Hand, 240 of those assumed to be built within the next 5 years.
Yes.
Anything else you wish to say?
Yes. Obviously, with this the 450 is divided into 3 different groups. One is private market. The other 2 sites, 300, are the council building their own homes and an RSL getting involved. That still leaves part of the site, but what we haven't done is applied for the detail of any of the other sites. But the current application approval will allow access to the remainder of the site to be developed at some other point in time.
So the overall capacity is still on the 35 hectares, is still 700.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
And it's just the way that the site's being phased and released.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Understood. Right. Any other comments about the allocations listed in the supply from the allocations listed in policy 6.3 and the contribution they would make to the 5-year supply that anyone wishes to make? No. Okay. So now let's talk about the commitments. These are sites that have got planning permission on the 1st of April 2021. And as I said, three of the sites that are included in the submitted plan as allocations, because they didn't have planning permission in 2020, now do have. So they've been counted as commitments by the council. And we've got tables of figures in the council's updated response to SQ5. The updated information shows that some of the commitments have been completed or have been developed further over the last year, and 3 allocations, as I said, have now got planning permission, and there are 6 new commitments that have been added to the list, and 1 planning permission that was on the list previously has expired, so that's no longer a commitment, and no assumptions made about that contributing to supply, I guess. So the net effect overall of all of that is that 3,119 completions are expected on the commitments between 2021 and 2036. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Yeah, so that's the updated figure.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, based on earlier information, I suppose this was, but in the statements and the representations made, some participants pointed out that a lot of the committed sites are listed in table 6.4 in the plan. So that's when the plan was submitted. I hadn't started. Some were quite old, and some were close to lapsing. So you've listed all of the commitments in the pages of your statement, on the last 3 pages of your statement, and this provides information about each in terms of the dates for permission and the assumptions. You've got the trajectory that deals with each of them. There are about 40 sites, I think, or there were them. There's probably more now. I'd count it up about 40. It's something in that nature, anyway. So,
yeah.
So
that sounds about right. So yeah, it's just missing off those 6 new additional ones we added on yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of those 40, I counted up, I think, that only a limited number had not started. Is that correct?
Yes, from our records now, sir. There was about 8, but when you read the notes and the side column of that commentary as well, there's a couple of those that have actually started. So from our records, there's 4 now that haven't commenced development. So the number of not started has significantly reduced now. A lot of sites have come online and started building out since this proposed submission plan was submitted for examination.
Okay, so from your point of view, that's not an issue. The fact that some of these sites had old permissions and they were going to expire and development was going to start. You're saying that virtually all of them now are underway.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
That brings me on to another issue. Some plans assume a lapse rate for commitments, i.e., because there's evidence that however many planning permissions you grant, some of them won't get either developed out or some of them will expire, and some of them. Any reason why the council hasn't applied a lapse rate to commitments?
The council's been quite proactive and I think successful in terms of delivery over the last few years, and we've had quite a low number of permissions actually lapsing. For instance, when we've been in a situation of not having a 5-year housing land supply, we've been putting on permissions shorter timescales for implementation as well. So that's helped to boost supply, and developers are getting on site straight away. Basically, there's very limited number of permissions lapsing and developers doing things such as land banking. And we had a quick assessment over the last 4 years how many major schemes lapsed, and there was only 2 that lapsed. If you bear with me, I'll get the details on those. But one was the housing commitment at the airport, Teesside International Airport. That was a permission for 350 dwellings. But since the airport changed ownership recently, the new owners, Tees Valley Combined Authority, didn't want to pursue that housing site any further. So so hence the outline permission lapsed, and they didn't come forward with the reserve matters. And then the second permission, which lapsed in 1920, it's called Forsyth Business Centre on Woodlands Road. That was for quite a small scheme of 18 dwellings, and that was actually just a prior approval permission, and it's from our understanding that it went back to office use, so it didn't come forward for housing. So I think in the grand scheme of things over the last 4 years, that demonstrates that our lapse rates are quite low, and we are quite successful in schemes building out. And in terms of smaller schemes, that some have lapsed, but again, the numbers didn't seem significant over that 4-year period. Kind of looking at, I think it ranged between 20 and 40 units each over those four years. So not significant numbers. Therefore, we didn't think it was necessary to apply a lapse rate to our commitments.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. We talked this morning, and we can come back to it again in terms of the overall supply for the planned period. And the ultimate judgment is whether I think there's enough land identified in the plan to ensure that the housing requirement can be met. And there's different ways you can look at that, and different assumptions you can make. One is to apply lapse rates, one's to make discounts for whatever reasons, others to have as a healthy buffer over the requirement to supply overall, which I think you said this morning that the council has got, and that provides some flexibility. So if some permissions do lapse, well, you've got flexibility in the supply to make.
Yes, that's correct, sir. In that updated note of DBC 6.2, there's an update on the buffer in there as well. It's now 17.7%, so a healthy buffer of land supply.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. Right, we'll deal with contribution that commitments. Oh, do you want to just comment on what Mr. Madison said about, is it Northgate House in the town centre?
Oh yes, yes, so that is a commitment in the schedule. If you just bear with me, I'll find the number. It's site 228. So it is in the trajectory. It is for 96 units. It had a prior approval on it. It is due to lapse shortly, and Mr. Madison is correct in that there was a recent prior approval application submitted on the site, and that was refused for, I believe it was over 100 units. I think it was for 106, taking in another floor of the building. But unfortunately, it was the application was refused on the grounds of limited information provided with the prior approval. So it wasn't in terms of the merits of the scheme. It was the council needed further information on highways and public health grounds, I believe.
Okay, well, anyway, that's there in your list of housing commitments, so that's assumed to contribute. That's all part of the numbers. Thank you for clarifying that.
No problem.
Good. Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. I don't got any more questions. 1 minute. Right. Anything anybody else wishes to say about the contribution that the commitments are assumed to make to the planned period overall before we look at the contribution they may make to the 5-year supply? Mr. Chisholm.
Yes, thank you, sir. Could the council confirm the situation at site 68? That's West Park.
Mr. Chisholm. Yes, the role of the hearings is for me to ask questions and get information.
I'm sorry.
It's not an opportunity really for you to come here and ask questions to the council. If you're telling me which site is it you're suggesting?
Well, sorry, I'll put it a different way.
Yeah.
Site 68 West Park is a commitment, and if I understand the trajectory correct, the build out rate is that there will still be 360 houses committed post 2036. I think that's the only commitment that is post 2036. I'm confused as to whether that should be included in depending on the construction rate that the developers are able to, some of that could be before 2036.
Sorry, are you saying you don't think the West Park Garden Village site will deliver the number of dwellings assumed in the plan period?
I think it will. I think it may deliver some of the post 2036 dwellings before 2036.
Okay, understood. So right, got that noted. So it could some of the sites that are assumed to contribute after the plan period as well as during it. The issue then is, well, could more of it come forward earlier?
That's correct. Yeah, thank you.
Understood. Thank you very much. Well, we'll get the council to respond if we want to get any other comments. Mr. Hall.
Thank you, sir. Based upon your comments just earlier, then that was, you picked up what we said in our statement, but there were two issues. Clearly, we've now examined the list, and there are still a few permissions that seem very, if you like, quiet and potentially going to lapse. But if I accept the council's figures for now, just to help you, because we also talked about a lapse rate. So if the range we were just given was 20 to 40 units, I think, per annum. If I was trying to write everything down rapidly.
Yeah.
But if you took that on the council's preferred lower housing target, that is 10%, isn't it? Roughly 40 out of 400 and something. I've just used a calculator, don't worry. Yeah. But even if you went on the higher target, which is the modification you may or may not accept, that's still an 8% lapse rate. And you know from Durham probably that I talk quite a bit about lapse rates and non-implementation, and just about every local plan evidence base has one. I mean, it's impressive if they've kept it that low. I'll certainly say that, but I do think it should be at least considered and factored in.
Yes,
there are quite a few permissions, and there is still some lapsing going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable, isn't it? There's going to be some, I suppose.
And it had, and we know some sites that we raised a couple, but I think they've answered one of them. But I would have thought there should be some lapse rate, or at least that factors into your thinking vis-a-vis the target and the buffer.
Yeah, I guess that's the other way to look at it, is to say, well, they haven't received a lapse rate, in which case I'd expect a healthier buffer over the requirement to ensure that the inevitable lapses that are going to occur don't jeopardise meeting the requirement overall. That's another way of dealing with it.
Yes, I just thought it's an important piece of the machine, isn't it, or cog, because if you're looking at buffer, which target, etc., it would be remiss of me not to point out that 8 to 10% potentially per annum.
Yeah, okay.
But that's all. That was all for now. If there's any, unless I can help further, thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments about the commitments and there are some assumed contribution to the planned period? Because I'm going to come on to the 5-year supply now, which is where there's slightly different evidential requirements for the council to demonstrate in terms of whether they're making realistic assumptions about the 5-year supply. Mr. Chisholm, you've got the hand raised. Is that left over, or is it something else on the commitments? Okay, thank you. Right. So in terms of 5-year supply, I need to be satisfied that the easiest way to assess whether there's a 5-year supply now is to look at the evidence, so we can do that. I need to be satisfied that there's it's likely that there'll be a 5-year supply when the plan's adopted, which is obviously not now, it's in the future, and obviously things are going to change. But as a starting point for that consideration, I need to know whether it's a 5-year supply now. If not, there may be good reasons why that is the case in some plans, in which case, you need to look carefully at the trajectory to see how that may change. There needs to be, a reasonable prospect there's going to be a 5-year supply maintained, not just when the plan's adopted, but ideally for the planned period. But that's not necessarily going to be the case, because obviously if development takes place faster than envisaged, the 5-year supply is likely to go down. And it becomes a review issue about whether the plan needs to be reviewed. But anyway, so what I need to be satisfied is that there's a 5-year requirement now, and there's likely to be when the plan's adopted, and there's likely to be for a good number of years after that, based on the trajectory. So that's what I'm doing here. So the council's revised response to SQ5, which was published yesterday, DBC 6.2, sets out the 5-year housing and requirement supply as at the 1st of April 2021. And this, in terms of the commitments, we'll come on to allocations later. This assumes that a total of 1,670 would be on commitments between 2021 and 2026. That figure, I think, is the sum of rows B and C on the middle table on page 6. Is that right, Fiona McCall?
Sorry, sir, just checking that myself. Yes, so 1,670. That would be a combination of those with detailed and outline.
Yeah, that's right. So 910 of those would be on sites of 10 or more dwellings with detailed planning permission. So they're the ones where you can assume that they will deliver in 5 years, unless there's evidence to suggest that they won't be for whatever reason. So the proof is, the onus is on others to demonstrate those wouldn't do. So I won't ask you too much about those. If people want us to point that up, they can. But 760 would be on sites of 10 or more with only outline permission. So, you know, the evidential burden is on the council to demonstrate that there's a reasonable prospect that those will come forward. So let's look at the four committed sites that make up that. There are just 4, I think, aren't there?
1, 2, 3. Yes, that's correct, sir.
Yeah. So we've got Bertree Lane, Berrymead Farm, West Park Garden Village, which Mr. Chisholm's mentioned, and site 146 in Middleton St George. So the clear evidence the council has is summarised in Appendix 1 to your Matter 4 hearing statement.
Yes, that's correct, sir.
So that's not.
Yes,
you haven't updated, have you? I've not.
No, we haven't updated that. No, since the only update was yesterday's document 6.2.
That doesn't change any of the figures there, does it, for those sites?
No, there's no implications for those sites from yesterday's update. No, because sorry, sir. Yesterday's figures were detailed permissions. There was one outline permission which was put in the trajectory, but it's not within the 5-year supply.
Yeah, okay. So it's still these 4 sites. I mean, you wrote your Matter 4 statement, I can't remember when now, a few weeks ago anyway.
A little while ago now.
Yeah, can't remember. But you may have gathered a bit more information since then, but let's just go through them if we could. So south of Bertree Lane, it was an allocation, now it's a commitment. This assumes 135 in the next 5 years, yeah? Is that right?
Bear with me, sir. I've got 120, I think. So.
I'm looking at.
Oh. Oh, sorry, sir. I think I'm looking at a wrong version. Sorry, sir. 30, 60, 90, 120. Yes, 135. Sorry, sir. There's been a few different versions.
The document you published yesterday, and it's the table that runs from 5 to 6, and it's the category C, sites of 10 or more dwellings with outline planning permission. The first one, south of Bertree Lane, 135. And that's
that's correct. Sorry, sir.
Estates, planning approval, fixed estates, 106 agreement, discharge of conditions, reserve matters, applications by Miller. It's waiting a decision still. Is that still the situation?
As I understand it, yes, sir. They're still considering that application, but I don't think there's any significant issues after liaising with our colleagues in development management, but it's still under consideration.
And Miller Homes saying they'll start development this year once those conditions have been discharged and the reserve matters approved. It assumes 15 being completed this year.
Yes, it does. Yeah, I don't think there's been any indication to say that they wouldn't be looking to get started on site.
Well, Mr. Litherland's here representing.
Yeah, I was going to say I could.
We'll
the developers here, he might be able to.
Okay, right. So that's that one. Berrymead Farm. Again, this was an allocation. Now it's got permission. This assumes again it'll start this year with 10, and then it'll deliver 60 a year, presumably based on the number of house builders that will be on this site. Reserve matter applications. Well, I don't need to go through it. I mean, people can read the evidence. It's in your statement, but I've noted it down. Anything you wish to say? Any update to that, or is that it's as you put in your statement?
I think it's a similar position to the Bertree Lane one. So it's still the reserve matters are under consideration, but no significant issues have arisen at this stage. So yes, just it's at an advanced stage of the planning application process. So evidence and delivery.
West Park Garden Village. So this is underway, this site, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. So we've kept it within the outline category because there's sections of it that do have reserve matters approval, and they're gradually getting those approvals at the moment, I think. So yeah, there's a remainder part of the site that's probably still just got the outline, but there are a number of reserve matters approvals on there as well. So it's set out within that appendix 1 to matter 4.
6 builders involved. And so that assumes 30 this year, 30 next year, then rising to 60, presumably as.
Yes, there's more. Yeah, I think the landowner for that and the developer Bussey Armstrong have indicated a higher delivery rate on that site within that 5-year period, but we've just taken a bit more of a cautious approach. But that site could potentially have a higher delivery rate given the number of outlets on there.
Right, so you mean it could be, say, 90 a year rather than 60, given that there are more than,
Potentially, yeah, yes, sir.
And finally, the other one is the land south of the railway at Middleton St George. Again, this assumes starting this year. It's got outline and the section 106 is in place, and discharge of conditions applications have been approved. Reserve matters recently applied for, and this is a Bellway site.
Yes, sorry, sir.
Yeah, okay, and again, starts this year, 15, and then rising to 30 based on one developer, presumably.
Yes, sir. The site's split in 2, and there's actually 2 reserve matters applications on that. So there's 100 dwellings from Bellway on one RM, and then 230 from Berkeley de Vere. So the site's split in 2.
Okay. Well, okay, thank you for that. So I'll go over to others. So there's 4 sites to talk about here that seem to contribute to the 5-year supply. And I'll see if anyone wants to challenge any of those or support any of those. I don't need a great deal of information to support, but just one question before I leave, though. There's no commitments for less than 10 included in the supply, are there? Small site commitments, or are there? Or is it just that there aren't any? Or are they all? Maybe they're all included. Sorry.
There is the small sites allowance at the end of the trajectory, sir.
Yeah.
So there's the 25 per year.
But sorry, does the commitments that are listed either in categories B or C, or possibly it does? Does it go? It goes down to 1 dwelling, does it?
No, so the commitments list just includes commitments of 10 and above. We haven't included any smaller sites in that list.
Why? Why is that? Well, actually, there's a couple.
Is there?
Well, no, they might not be small sites. They're expected completions. There's one for
maybe it's the remaining dwellings.
Yeah, that maybe it's the
remaining. Sorry.
Yeah. That's what I assume, that these commitments are only 10 or above. So you've not included a sum total for smaller site commitments.
No, but we have got the small sites allowance in the trajectory going forward, and then going back over, we do count those small sites completions.
And they're in trajectory aims in the last few years. And they, so that doesn't, well, it doesn't really matter, but in terms of how many dwellings there would be on small site commitments now, it would be 3 or 4 dozen. It wouldn't be hundreds or anything like that.
No, it's I think our evidence on small sites delivery over the past, your preliminary question showed it was, I think the average was about 37 per annum on average. So not significant numbers. So that's hence why we've gone for the 25 per annum allowance.
So basically, to keep it simple and to avoid any overcounting, because some plans assume a small site, they count small site commitments, and then they also include a small site allowance looking ahead, and then there's some issue about whether they overlap or whatever. So there's no, it's on the cautious side again. You're not counting any commitments under 10 at the moment, but you're making a small site allowance ahead of 25. Okay, thank you for that.
Sorry, thank you, sir.
All right. Okay, over to others then. Does anybody wish to question or support the 4 sites I've just mentioned in terms of their contributions to the 5-year supply? Jennifer Longstaff. This is West Park Garden Village, I guess.
That's correct, yes. Site 68. It's just in response to Mr. Chisholm's comments, and just to back up Fiona's comments as well, that the West Park Garden Village is very much underway, and it's anticipated that the remaining units will be delivered during the plan period.
And the 5-year supply, you're fully confident that those deliveries will be met or exceeded?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. That's nice and to the point. Ben Stevenson, Persimmon.
Thank you, sir. Just in relation to Berrymead Farm, as one of the landowners and developers of that site, we would agree with Fiona's analysis, with 250 dwellings coming forward within the first 5 years. We have 2 reserve matters applications outstanding, which hopefully will be approved, and then it's our intention to get on site as soon as we can after that.
So you're confident that 10 will be completed this year?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, by end of March next year, isn't it? This financial year. Okay. Right, thank you for that. Stephen Litherland.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm not actually instructed by Miller Homes Teesside, I'm instructed by Miller Homes Strategic Land, but I do know the site at
Right, okay.
It is yeah, I think if the site hasn't got reserve matters, to be fair, I don't think we'll be getting 15 units off in this financial year. But I would have said I've just texted the land director, and we're still confident on the 135 in the 5-year period.
So sorry, you don't think it may not start this year, the 15?
Correct,
but you think it's reasonable to think 135.
We assume that we can absorb that 15 over the next 4-year period, so 135 still comfortable over 5 years.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. All right, Neil Westwick.
So I think with me and Mr. Lilland's done the same job. Litchfields are the agents of that application, but we're not acting directly for the site. But yes, essentially the 15 this year may be a challenge. You understand there's a meeting today at 4 o'clock to finalise the last bit of the reserve matters to essentially get that to a decision. So essentially, it looks like in terms of total delivery over the 5 years, Miller Homes and the landowners are confident that will take place.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right, and Mr. Chisholm.
Thank you, sir. Bussey and Armstrong confirmed clearly that West Park Garden Village would be completed within the planned period. So I take it that includes the 360 dwellings that the trajectory says won't be completed until after the planned period.
Okay, let's go back and just get clarification on that.
Yes, I understand that. Apologies, sorry there. Yes, I believe that is the case.
Well, the site will be fully developed in that plan period.
Within the plan period, that's correct.
Right. Okay. So what would that add to the supply then? What does the plan assume?
The entire site in its entirety was 1,200 units. I believe there's consent now for about 800, but as Fiona mentioned, it's coming through in parcels.
Yeah, so the plan assumes all the 1,200 will be built in the plan period, is it right?
That's correct.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, thank you. Right. Your hand's still up, Mr. Chisholm. Is there anything else? Okay, thank you. Stephen Litherland, your hand is up.
Apologies, sir, it shouldn't be.
Okay, fine. Fiona McCall.
Sorry, sir. It was just to clarify the West Park situation, site 68. Yeah, obviously the trajectory is an estimate of delivery on site. So we've taken a bit more of a cautious approach with our estimates and don't want to be overly optimistic. So that's why we've just made an estimate for West Park that 861 units will be delivered over the plan period. So there will be a remainder of the outstanding figure post, but obviously this is as outlined in the plan, the trajectory is an estimate and it's indicative, and sites can come forward sooner if they can do.
Yeah, okay. So there's a number of allocations that are you assume will develop out over beyond 2036 just because of the scale of them and the nature of them.
Yes.
But there's nothing in the plan to prevent them coming forward earlier, as Mr. Chisholm said. It's quite likely. We'll come to the implication of that later when we look at the overall balance between supply and requirement, I guess, is where it needs to. Right. Any other comments on commitments then? No. Okay. Let's just deal with windfalls before we have a break, and then we'll come back and look at what all of this tells us for the overall supply for the planned period. Fiona McCall's just clarified that the plan assumes a small site allowance, includes a small site allowance in the trajectory of 25 per year. And there's no double counting of that with any small site commitments that exist now, because those are not counted in. So that's that. But there's a slight anomaly in the plan in the sense that paragraph 6.2.3 states that windfalls have not been included in trajectory, whereas the Appendix A trajectory clearly does allow a 25 per year. So does paragraph 6.2.3 need modifying?
Sorry, sir. Yes, that was an oversight, and that paragraph, the small sites allowance was added on after that section of the plan was written, and we overlooked updating that. Apologies.
Yeah, no, fine. Okay.
So I believe there is a main modification proposed in the last schedule of main modifications, if I remember correctly. Sorry, there's been that many. I'm losing track a little bit, but I'm sure there is a modification proposed in there to just update that paragraph.
Yes, it does. Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's done. I mean, I think I'll come at the end of this. We'll come back to how the overall supply is summarised in the plan. It may be another slight modification is needed just to pull it all together in the table, which you've done in your response to SQ5. It's just that doesn't quite exist in one place. So, and I mean, you can make an assumption. I mean, NPPF's clear that there needs to be clear evidence for making windfall assumptions. You've provided evidence of the completions on small sites between 2009 and 2020, I think, and that was the average of 37. So I suppose, well, why 25? Why not 30 or 35 or?
Yeah, I guess again it's the same reasoning. So we just didn't want to be overly optimistic and just taken a cautious approach. And although you have the average, I think if you look at each year's figures, they do rise and fall quite sharply. So it's not a steady figure each year. So I think that's why we've taken that approach.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of allowance for larger windfalls, again, I mean, this does depend on the nature of the plan area, because in some areas larger windfalls are more likely than others, I suppose. There's no allowance made, there is there, for large. I mean, you based the 37, that was a small site windfall average over time, wasn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
So, the 25 can be compared to that, and that can be described as not being overly optimistic, being cautious. There's no allowance for larger windfalls. Is that because, again, it's being on the cautious side, but is it also to do with the nature of the borough? And
it's basically to do with the age of the old policies. The current development plan is based on a 1997 local plan and a core strategy from 2011 I believe. So those policies are quite outdated now in terms of the actual housing allocations within them. So a lot of the major schemes that have come forward over recent years would in fact be classed as windfall. So the evidence would be difficult to show a windfall allowance, given that all of those sites coming forward would have been categorised as windfall sites. So we just don't have that evidence to justify a windfall allowance for major schemes, basically.
I mean, one of the areas that the plan identifies is the town centre fringe, isn't it? There's a specific policy on that, and that talks about mixed-use development there.
Yes.
There's opportunities within the town centre itself, I guess, and potentially other bits of the built-up areas. But again, there's no numerical assumption made about that, but further windfalls could come forward over and above the 25. Or it's almost inevitable, isn't it, that further windfalls will come along over and above the 20 assumed in numerical terms.
Yes, I think the sites that we added in yesterday, a number of those were within the main urban area, so that emphasises that more sites should come forward.
Okay, well, again, we'll look at all of these sort of different assumptions and non-assumptions, as you mean, when we look at the overall picture, and people will have different views about whether the supply that's identified in the plan is adequate to ensure that their needs can be met, and others may view that it's excessive in the sense that you don't need all that land to meet the needs. Any comments that people wish to make about the windfall assumption? Sorry, Ross Chisholm.
Yes, CPRE are disappointed that there's been no attempt to suggest a figure for larger site windfalls. In the statement that was submitted, where we gave evidence to show that recently there has been a steady supply, a stream of new sites since the consultation draft was produced. And we suggest that something in the order of about 130 to 150 dwellings per annum are being produced by these windfalls. We suggest that, all right, to be on the safe side, let's assume something like 50% of these could be estimated to continue and be included in the overall supply. And I which could be something like 845 to 975 dwellings in the remainder of the planned period. And I think, to be quite honest, that this figure is likely to be exceeded if the council's strategy for the town centre and the fringe is successful, and that the council and that landowners, developers and funding agencies can work together to realise the numerous opportunities that do exist. And it would suggest that if these sites do not come forward, then the council's strategy has failed.
Right, thank you very much. So yes, I don't know, you may have provided the figures for the CPR in the Green Party. I've got slightly different figures, but their representations or their statements have both identified numbers of sites that have come forward since the draft Reg 18 plan was prepared. So at that time, obviously, the council did everything it could to identify allocations. And what you're saying is, well, look, that's what happens. You can do your best to identify allocations at a particular point in time, but the other opportunities will come forward. And you can look at numerically, even in the last 3 years. I think you've referred to 450, or the CPRE for 450. I think the Green Party 400 on a number of sites. So I understand the point entirely. So thank you.
Yes, we have 4 applications which haven't been determined yet for sites in the urban area. So this identifies and is evidence that there is a continuing stream of new sites emerging.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Councillor Holroyd, Green Party. Obviously, you don't need to repeat the points I've got and the points
of course. You also raised one of the points that I was going to mention about the town centre fringe and the regeneration, and obviously you would hope that some housing would come forwards as part of that. Ken Madison has also mentioned Northgate Tower, and that's been a long-term eyesore, shall we call it, that's been in need of regeneration. So again, you would hope that would come through. But also, as we see the impacts.
That house is included in the commitments list.
Okay, good. But also, as we see some impacts of Brexit with and obviously coronavirus, you may see businesses relocating elsewhere and vacating premises that become available for conversion to housing.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, fair point. I mean, shops, offices, those sort of uses that may be less demand for floor space in them in the future.
We've had a large office building, Deep Ocean, that have moved elsewhere recently, so I don't know what's due to happen to their building.
Presumably Northgate House was offices, was it? Well, you may not know. Sorry, I don't. Yeah.
I don't
anyway,
know its history, I'm afraid.
No. Jennifer Longstaff.
Thank you, sir.
Windfalls.
It's just in response to, again, back up to West Park Garden Village. As I've mentioned in my reps too, I appreciate we're not going through our mission sites, but there is a bit of white land up there. Our client site 390. At this moment in time, it could potentially fall as a windfall development site. So it's just to say, first of all, we support the modification in terms of the glossary. But there is an example of a potential windfall site that may come forward larger than the anticipated small numbers that have been mentioned.
That site, I know, I did look at it. It's a triangular site, isn't it? To the north of the West Park Garden Village, yeah.
That's correct.
It's in the development limits, isn't it?
It's within the development limits. It's just a bit of an anomaly in terms of between a commitment site and the garden village at Faverdale.
Yeah. I think there was well, I don't know, we don't need to go into it, but I mean, I suppose because it's within the development limits, there's a policy that allows appropriate development. I don't know what the, subject to criteria, there's a policy that allows development on within the development limits. So again, but thank you for that as an example of another opportunity that could come forward in terms of it being a windfall.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ken Madison.
Yes, I'm just assuming that there will be the facility for brownfield sites to fall into the windfall category, or is that a completely separate line?
Sorry, when you say you broke it up a little bit there.
How many... Will brownfield sites be included in the windfall section, or is that a separate entity altogether?
No, I think that we're largely talking about brownfield sites when we're talking about windfalls. I mean, it's possibly there could be some greenfield windfalls, but I imagine most would be brownfield. So what we're talking about is the assumption the plan makes about those, which is 25 a year. Mr. Chisholm and the Green Party are making the point, well, it could be considerably more than that, in the sense that, it could be more like 150 a year on brownfield sites coming forward that have not been identified in the plan.
Yeah, I was just thinking of an earlier discussion about Darlington, Simpson, Rolling Mills, as was, and that was given permission for 250. Hasn't been taken up as yet, but with a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of help, I'm sure that would be a great area to tidy up in the town, which again is one of my sort of issues. Should we not be trying to tidy the town up?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Got that point. Councillor Snedker, sorry.
Well done. Yes, thank you. My only point was something, this mention of buffer, which has been mentioned earlier, and I think someone mentioned like 17% buffer as being healthy. It seemed a bit, just the question I would ask is that sounds a bit chunky on the side of obese even, rather than being healthy.
Oh, hold on. We're going to come back to the overall supply later. It's further. It's next item on the agenda. I'm going to look at what all these figures add up. So
I jumped the gun. I do apologise.
It's all right. Don't worry. So what we're going to do now, unless there's any other comments about windfalls, and obviously I've got that's some interesting points there, and and some evidence that has been put forward by the CPRE and Green Party within Mr. Chisholm there about what more assumptions could be made about windfalls. So give me something to think about there. So thank you. So what we'll do now, we'll have a break until 3:30, I think, and then we'll come back and, as I say, look at the overall supply for the plan period, and then we'll move on to the 5-year requirement and supply. So if we just don't leave the meeting, just turn your camera off, turn your mic off, and resume at 3:30, please. Thank you. It's 3:30, so we'll resume now, if we could, please. So what I'm going to do now, we're on to the item on the agenda, the fourth item, which is about the overall supply for the plan period. I'm not going to go back and discuss all the things we've already discussed, but I just want to put the pieces of the jigsaw together and think about what that may mean in terms of meeting housing needs. So based on the updated information to April 2021, the housing supply information is set out as in the table on page 1 of DBC 6.2. It was published yesterday, and that gives the total of 11,579, which we already confirmed is what the overall supply is, and it's made up of completions, commitments, allocations, and a small site allowance. So we've already discussed whether the plan should be modified to update what it says about supply to take account of this, and the council's view is yes, it should, rather than as submitted. It just refers to the supply information as at April 2020. So if anyone's got any views about that, they can say so. I think I mentioned earlier when I was talking to Fiona McCall that it would be probably necessary for the plan, insofar as it's updating the supply information. It's, as she's pointed out, there's modification proposed to clarify that there is a windfall allowance in addition to the completions and commitments and allocations. It would be helpful, I think, having a table similar to that on page 1, towards the bottom of page 1 of DBC 6.2 included in the plan, to say what the to summarise the overall supply period for the plan period. That's that. The overall supply of 11,579, according to this note, and Fiona McCall mentioned it just now, represents a 17.7% buffer, or whatever we want to call it, over the requirement of what the target of 9840, I think. We should clarify that, but I assume it's over the higher requirement rather than the higher target rather than the lower requirement figure. So maybe you could just clarify that in a minute. But also, as Mr. Chisholm has alluded to, and others have alluded to, and it's clear from the documents, is that a number of sites have got capacity far greater than is assumed to be built. So in addition to those 11,579, again, this is identified in the plan, but it's also summarised in the document. There is additional capacity on the allocations beyond 2036 that adds up to 5,614, I think, and that's the Skirningham site where there's 2,850 after 2036, Faverdale 1,250, Great Burden 750, the Coniscliffe Park North and South sites together, there's a 584 after the plan period, and a whole farm 180, so that adds up to 5,614, I think. So that's additional. I mean, and there's nothing in the plan to stop that coming forward as well. Just to clarify again, just to be sure, the commitments, I think, are all assumed to be completed in the plan period, possibly with a exception of West Park Garden Village. Could you just clarify that for me? It's been mentioned a couple of times. How many dwellings are expected to be built after 2036, if any, West Park Garden Village?
Yes, that's correct. I believe it's just the West Park site, which on the commitments list, which will build out post that our estimates build out post 2036. So we have 861 in the plan period. So that would leave 339 beyond the post 2036.
That's not actually written down anywhere. I suppose it might be in the trajectory. Is it in Appendix A?
Yeah, in Appendix A, it's you've got total within plan period of 861.
Right.
I'm not quite sure whether.
But in the table 6.4, where the housing commitments are listed, it doesn't do it. It just says total number of dwellings, and then
it's got the remaining dwellings at April 2021 to be completed pre-2036. That's at the top of the table.
Yeah, but it doesn't tell you that there's some that would go on after 2036, is there?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Maybe that could be clarified.
Well, maybe not. Is it just that one site then?
Yes, it's just that one site in the commitments list. Yes.
When you add that to the 6 allocations that will continue building after 2036, that adds up to, well, it's about 6,000, isn't it? Just under 6,000.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, so you could say that the supply identified in the plan is around 17,500, something of that nature.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yeah.
right, and that compares to a base requirement of what it is now again.
8,440 is the base requirement, and then 9,840 the target.
Yeah, 9,840. Okay, and you said this morning, well, it's necessary to have some surplus over what you're trying to achieve, because there'll be some planning permissions that will lapse. Some of the allocations may not develop. Well, they may, so you're confident they will be developed because you've done a sort of assessment and you've got evidence for all of them. But some of them may develop more slowly. It's possible something could happen to stop some of them, a number of them being developed, but I suppose it's unlikely. And then there's the assumptions about windfalls potentially on top of that 17,500. You've allowed, that includes 25 a year on small sites, but as others have said, well, there could be considerably more than that as well. So. And on the other side of the equation, I suppose, is the only thing I think on the other side of the equation is the elapse rate. I don't think anyone's suggesting that you've overinflated the capacity figures for any of the sites or anything like that. So, right, okay. So you'd describe it as an appropriate level of flexibility over what needs to be required in the plan period, I think is what you said earlier.
Yes, that's correct, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get views from others then on that overall picture. Yeah, thank you. Mr. Chisholm.
Thank you, sir. Yes, CPRE, we've done some calculations or some sums of our own, sir, and we suggest that if you include small site windfalls at the 37 per annum that you suggest, which is realistic and sound in our view.
Yeah.
And if you add a sum for, shall we say, 845 to use a figure for larger site windfalls, then you get a total of 12,599, which is an over allocation, if I can put it that way, over the 9840 target of some 3,087 dwellings. So we are suggesting that sites could be removed and still meet that target. And it so happens, if I may suggest, that the 3087 over allocation can be put right by removing Skirningham, Connerscliffe North, Connerscliffe South, Maxgate Farm and Blackwell Grange, which total 2918. What we're saying is you don't need any of those sites to meet the target.
Would that allow, okay, so you're building a bigger windfall allowance and you would reduce you'd take away the flexibility, would you? So you wouldn't have...
Yes, I mean, the over allocations are based on Bussey and Armstrong assuring us that West Park Garden Village will be complete by 2036. And that produces a grand total of something like 18,500 houses that the plan otherwise would be providing, which is what, almost a doubling of the 9840, which is the target.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to Councillor Snedker, because the point you were making earlier, I think, is he there?
I'm here. Yes, I'm sorry. I did jump the gun slightly. I know we were ready for a break, weren't we? The question I was asking, and maybe we could investigate further, is this this buffer and 17% being called healthy. And my question was, is that too big, too chunky, and was it going to get us to as like an obesity rather than a healthy position? And so the question is, I think that we're being slightly too generous to developers by allocating sites to have a buffer of that quantity, when we've heard from the council that actually they're very good at getting planning allocations built. The lapse rate is low, and the developers seem very confident that they're going to hit all their times and targets. And so my question to you, sir, is whether that allocation of a buffer of 70% is actually over generous.
So if you went back to, say, Mr. Hall's figure, I think he, based on what Fiona McCall had said about the lapse rate of 40 or so a year, that would be, I think he said 8 to 10% or something like that.
I think that would be considered far more reasonable. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay.
And taken in consideration with what Mr. Chisholm has just said, I think that would also point to a lower need and fewer allocations, site allocations required.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so two reasons why you could reduce it down to 8 to 10%. One, because of that reflects the sort of lapse rate, and two, because there will be windfalls inevitably on top of the identified supply, more than the 25 is what is the other argument there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've had a consistent track record of windfall sites, both small and large, within Darlington over quite some time now. So it shows that they are being brought forward.
Yeah, I mean, but as Fiona McCall said, the windfalls on larger sites is a bit distorted because they're judged against a policies map that was drawn in the 1990s, I think. So virtually any bit of land's likely to have been a windfall since then. But that said, there's clear examples being identified by the Green Party and the CPRE, sites that have come forward since this plan was prepared only 3 years ago in terms of drafts. So everything was done to identify all the sites through the HELA, but notwithstanding that, a number have come through and more identified by the council in its latest up. So yeah,
very true. As well. And as in earlier evidence given by the council, when we've mentioned brownfield sites not being on this site, we've had an undertaking from the council or a recognition that they are investigating them for social house building. So they might not meet the commercial developers requirement for deliverability, but there have been cases where the council have talked about looking at them again for social building, where maybe the profit margin wasn't needed there. So yes, that's why we're saying that some larger sites are undoubtedly going to come forward.
Yes. Okay. Right. Any other? Well, let's go to a different perspective then, Mr. Bonner.
Thank you, sir. I suppose contrary to the last 2 points, and we would say that the flexibility is very important, particularly when you look at the test of soundness, the need for a positively prepared plan. And if you remember Durham, it was very much a very tight set of allocations and commitments, and it was necessary to put other policies in there to make sure that supply wasn't affected by that. So by doing what this plan does, by having plenty of flexibility, it avoids that kind of situation. So the second point, which I appreciate a little bit back to front because we haven't heard about Greater Faverdale yet, but in terms of the trajectories, we are aligned with the local authority in terms of what we're predicting to deliver and contribute towards 5-year supply at the various points through the plan period. However, there is that clear benefit of the Garden Village scheme, which I suppose the mission is to really try and accelerate that growth. And that means that if other sites are failing, there's the scope that these kind of sites can mop some of that up. And that's obviously something we'll touch on next week. But the point I'm trying to get across, I suppose, is that what we've put in our evidence is still quite conservative.
Okay, thank you. Right, Mr. Westwick.
Thank you, sir. I won't go over what Mr. Bonner's just said, but I think my point is that the buffer of 17% is not inflated. It's a reasonable buffer. It is it's fairly standard across a lot of plans to have a similar level of buffer. So I would disagree with the comments that it's an inflated buffer, and I'm sure you'll hear more from Mr. Hands on this point.
Although, I mean, it's not just. I mean, the 17.7% is just the. That's not actually the buffer. Well, that is a buffer in the sense of what's assumed to be come forward in the plan period. But the supply identified, as I said, is actually 17,500 in terms of the size of the allocations and the fact that if there's the demand and need for them, they could come forward more quickly, could they not?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. They could, and I think it's about. For example, in regards to my site, it's Skirningham. It goes beyond the plan period, so which is identified in the NPPF. So essentially, they could come forward earlier, but essentially, it's supply that's likely to come forward after the plan period.
Mm. But it provides flexibility, doesn't it? I mean, it's not as if the supply is only 9,000. It's not as if the supply is only 11,500. As I said, it's actually 17,500 that the plan identifies, isn't it?
Yeah, it does provide flexibility. Yes, sir.
In terms of land that's available there, and if the industry wants to build the houses and sell them, it's there, and they can do it. I mean, once you get these sites started, I mean, I know there's a limit to how much you can churn out on any particular site, but they are large, so you could have different. You can vary the different outlets. I mean, you look at Skirningham and you look at the pockets of development, the way we talked about it, it could come forward in various different ways, couldn't it? In terms of once the road infrastructure is in, which we're going to talk about again tomorrow. So, yeah, okay. Thank you. Right. Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you, sir. It was just to point towards our matter 4 statement in response to question 4.17, where we do actually look at this 17% figure in some context in relation to a recently adopted plan that was found sound by an inspector in Harrogate, and in that case, that plan identified an over allocation or an oversupply of 25%, and what the inspector said there is that the NPPF does not prevent local authorities from allocating more sites than are needed to meet the housing requirement, and that is an appropriate response to build in flexibility to the plan and to adapt to rapid change. So, I think that 17% figure has been bounded around a little bit, but just to put it into some context, I think that is appropriate. I take your point that an overall supply of 17,500 or so has been identified, but of course, whilst we're saying that 11,579 is going to come forward in the plan period, some of that might not. Some of that might go beyond the plan period, and some of the oversupply might fall within the plan period. So of course it will ebb and flow across what is a 20-year plan.
Yeah, I suppose interesting point. I suppose. I mean, I don't like comparisons with the local plans because there's always different assumptions and the different things that are maybe factored into it. But I get the point about what the inspector said about the NPPF. It doesn't prevent more sites being allocated. In fact, I mean, as was alluded to by Mr. Bonner, it's positively prepared as an expectation, as a plan-led approach. So identifying land rather than relying on windfalls and things is encouraged. It provides the flexibility and the opportunities, I suppose, to boost supply. So in that sense, you could say, I think what you're saying is, well, unless any of the sites themselves are sound in itself, it's not unsound to have an excess, a healthy, what do you call it, a large buffer over. I
think that's important, and just one final thing. Obviously, this goes back to the first tranche of sessions a few weeks ago. We were discussing matters such as affordable housing supply and other benefits that the delivery of housing brings. And in terms of the additional affordable housing that this could deliver for the area and the social benefits that has to bring, I mean, that is a significant material consideration in a plan where the SHMA admits there is a significant need for affordable housing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Understood. Thank you. Right. Any other points from anyone on the overall supply and the difference between the identified supply and the requirement or the target? I'll come to Mr. Hand later, but I'll deal with the others. So, Councillor Holroyd from Green Party.
Thank you very much, sir. I just wanted to mention the problems that it can cause from oversupply and flooding the market. I can speak from personal experience. I tried for 2 years to sell a house to move because there is oversaturation of new homes in Darlington, and trying to sell an existing home was pretty much impossible. In the end, we sold at a loss. Which is great for new buyers, not so great if you have a home and want to move up slightly. But it is more likely to cause problems for those who already live here, and it's more likely to result in this donut of deprivation where people move outside and then you get only the landlords who own the houses just around the town centre, and result in more dilapidation of that sort of undesirable area. Obviously, if you've got a lot of excess allocation on Greenfield, there's more environmental impact, more people travelling out to the outside of the town that don't need to. So obviously for environmental, but also social, and you're more likely to get people supporting the economy in the town centre if they live within windfall sites, for example, that come up in the town centre. And it was just mentioned the social benefit of new housing, and certainly affordable housing, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But I have to point out that a lot of the housing allocations are of the executive home development style, which do not have a significant proportion of affordable housing content within them. So that would be a limited contribution, I would suggest.
Yeah, well, I'm going to look at that policy about the Pol's approach to exempting executive housing schemes from providing on-site affordable housing tomorrow, I think. So, yeah, okay. Right, thank you. Mr. Chisholm.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I seem to recall this morning that Mr. Hand confirmed that it's the council's position to keep a range with the 8440 as the minimum figure and the 9840 as the target. I would like to make the point that if there is to be a buffer, then that should be a percentage of the minimum and not the higher figure.
Oh yeah, well, as I said, I think that the way it was worked out, it was based on the higher figure. But I can't remember if I asked Fiona McCall to confirm that or not. But numerically, it would represent a bigger proportion over the lower figure if that was the case. Yeah, do you want to just confirm that?
Sorry, so yes, it was just to confirm the 17.7% over the higher 9840 figure. Yes.
Yeah, so obviously it would be a bigger percentage
over the lower. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Unless there are any other comments, Mr. Hand wanted to come in and make sure things aren't going off track.
Yes, sir, thanks. Really, it's just a comment on a couple of things that were said. Regarding windfall and the larger sites, if you take the pure definition of windfall, it's sites which have not been specifically identified as available in the local plan process. As Fiona mentioned earlier, the old plan was 1997 and had been largely developed out. Because we didn't have a 5-year supply a number of years ago, we'd been granting permissions on greenfield sites outside the plan. So in reality, you would have to say that they were windfall, but we haven't accounted for them because if we have a plan in place, we wouldn't be allowing those sort of sites. So to base an estimate on windfall on larger sites on an old plan, and Mr. Chisholm referred to permissions since the Regulation 18, that is permissions being given because we didn't have a 5-year supply, which were being developed out. So it's a bit of a misnomer just trying to base it on what's happened in the past, because that's not the way we want to plan going forward in the future. And just the other thing regarding our larger sites, which are planned for outside the plan period, that's partly to try and get a better place to live and better design and better facilities and communities and things. So to actually have a quantum of development, which over time will build a better place. So that is our strategy as far as building out larger places going forward and giving certainty for people in the future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously having a plan-led system and having a generous amounts of land identified does provide opportunities for the longer term as well. And it may mean that when you review the plan in however many years' time and update the plan, there's a need not to identify further areas of land, or not as many anyway. So I suppose on that. Right, okay, thank you. Yeah, good to have different perspectives and different things to think about. I've got plenty of numbers, more than enough numbers to think about. But I'll give that some further thought. So I want to move on now, if I could, please, to the 5-year requirement and supply. As I said earlier, I just want to be sort of satisfied that the plan, the nature of the supply identified in the plan will be likely to lead to an ongoing 5-year supply, because that's something that national policy requires. Whether you think it's a useful tool for meeting housing needs or not is not up for debate really today. Well, it's not, there's no point, because it's clearly obvious requirement of the NPPF. So we discussed under matter 2 the issue of expressing the requirement as a range. I don't want to go over that again. As I mentioned earlier, the council has set out that if I were to decide that it should be a single figure, it would go for the higher figure of 492 per year, or the 9840 overall. The council again said that it doesn't want to do that. I suppose one last sort of discussion, very brief discussion about that. I still find there's some illogic in the sense that if you're trying to achieve 492, and as I said, whether you like it or not, one of the key tools to do that is to maintain an ongoing 5-year supply. Surely that has to be related to the figure you're trying to achieve. I know PPG alludes to using the lower end of a range, but it doesn't explain why and in what circumstances, and it say that it's down to the plan making authority to justify it in the examination. So I'm not convinced that the council's justification that it would be penalised by using the higher figure is appropriate, is adequate in terms of justifying it. So I think, I'll say that. I won't invite comments now. I'm just going to go through what the numbers would be in the 2 different scenarios, and I'll pause there before we look at the supply side. Right, in terms of the response to SQ5, you set out how you'd work out the 5-year requirement as April 1st of April 2021, based on the minimum requirement of 8440, and that would be a 5-year requirement of 2,142. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then when I issued a further supplementary question, I asked how you'd work out the 5-year requirement based on the higher target of 9840, that also took account of any completions, but adding any cumulative shortfall in the plan in the period between 2016 and 2021 to the next 5-year requirement, rather than spreading it over the remainder of the plan period, because I think that's what clearly the PPG expects you to do.
Yes.
It's a bit complicated, isn't it? Because you should make up the shortfall in the next 5 years, but if you've had a surplus, you shouldn't take that off the shot over the next 5-year requirement. So there's a sort of different ways of working it out, I think, depending on whether you've had a cumulative shortfall or a cumulative surplus since the base date of the plan. That's my understanding of what the PPG expects. Anyway, thank you for doing that, and you've set out what that is in your response DBC 10, and that gives a figure of, and I'd agree with the way you've worked it out there, and that gives a figure of 546 homes per year between 2021 and 2026 would be the requirement. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Okay, right. Does anybody want to say anything about that 5-year requirement before we look at what the supply is and how adequate it is against that? Maybe they don't. Right. I suppose when I asked questions earlier, I think in my statements, I asked whether, and people responded in their statements, I asked whether the plan should set out how the 5-year requirement would be worked out. I think a number of people said, no, you don't need to, because it's clear in the PPG. But actually, I don't think it is clear totally, in the sense that people do it differently. So my suggestion would be that it should be set out in the plan to be unambiguous, That would certainly be the case if there's going to be 2 housing figures in it. Anyway, no one seems to have any comments about that, so I can move on. In terms of the 5-year supply then, so your revised response to SQ5, the DBC 6.2, identifies at the bottom of page 4 a total figure in red of 2,920, and that's based on the sites we've already talked about, the commitments and the allocations and the assumptions made about those, and none of those have actually been seriously questioned, I don't think. So that figure is 2920, yeah?
Yes, that's correct, sir. Yes.
And that's added up with the commitments, 1,670. Allocations without planning permission, 1,125, and small site allowance, 125.
Sorry, could you just run over those again? Sorry, sir, I've just got to the correct table.
Yeah, sorry. Commitments 1,670. Yeah, sorry, this is me adding your numbers up again. In the summary table on page 6, I've added together
right.
2 different commitment figures to get the 1,670.
Oh, is that yes, the 2 commitments, yep.
Yeah.
And then the allocations are 1,125.
And a small site allowance.
Yes.
Of 125.
Of 125, yes.
That adds up to 2,920.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
Okay, fine. Right, fine. So compared to the 5-year requirement based on the minimum, that would give a surplus of 778. I should have put these figured out before. I mean, this is simply doing the maths, so I may make a mistake. So the 5-year requirement based on the lower end of the range is 2,142, yeah?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Supply is 2,920. So I'm just taking the one from the other. I don't know if you've got a calculator, you want to check this, but that's what I made it to be. Someone can no doubt. I make, and then for the higher, the housing, if you base the 5-year requirement based on the 9840, I make the surplus as 191, because again, it's 2,920, your identified supply, minus 2,729, which is the figure provided in based on the one we just talked about.
Yes, that sounds right, sir.
Okay, well, someone can tell me if those are wrong. So on either basis, there's a 5-year supply.
Yes, that's correct, sir. Yes, in either scenario, yes.
Yeah, okay. In terms of the requirement already includes a buffer, so it's got a 5% buffer built in.
Yes.
So on one level, you've got, so long as you meet it, you've got a 5-year supply, including a bit of a buffer, and the buffer's purpose is to provide the flexibility and choice. But on top of that 5% buffer, which is 130, I think, isn't it, including in your table? The 5-year requirement, 5% buffer.
Around about 102, is it?
Is it?
Sorry, I haven't done it as a separate what the 5% was. I've added it to the 2040, which would result in 2,142 as the 5-year requirement with the buffer. So that would be, the buffer would be 2046. So it'll be a buffer of 102.
102, is it? Yeah, okay. So you've already got that buffer built in with the 5%, and then on top of that, even on the housing, meeting the housing requirement of the higher figure, you would add another 190. So overall, you'd have a buffer of about 300. Yeah, over the 5-year requirement at present.
That sounds right, sir. I think yes.
I'm mixing 2 different uses of the word buffer. You've got the buffer that you have to include anyway, and then you've also got something over and above.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Sorry, sir. Yes.
So looking at overall what the flexibility is.
Yes.
Okay. Right. I mean, you can turn that into a number of years supply if you wish. I mean, I don't tend to do that. So let's think about, so from the council's point of view, you've got a 5-year supply and it's got some margin for flexibility in it. We've also talked about the extent to which the assumptions have been made are cautious or not. And, you know, I can make a judgment about that. So, okay, thanks. But looking ahead at the trajectory, you know, you've mentioned several times already that you're holding back granting planning permissions because of the fact that allocations, you know, are waiting for this process to go through, and that some of the allocations are going to start coming on stream once permissions are granted and they can start. So does that mean that the trajectory looks more healthy, or, you know, with more flexibility in it as you look ahead? Is that what the trajectory shows us in terms of this 5-year supply, you know, in future years?
I'd say for those sites where there's still the allocations, where they do have applications on them at the moment, and that we're looking at them positively after the plan is adopted, there is still, if you just bear with me and I'll just check a couple. There are still sort of lead-in times for completions to happen. We're still not being overly optimistic. For instance, South Connerscliff Park, we've got 30 dwellings down for 22-23, but for, I believe, Connerscliff Park North, we've pushed it back slightly further because we know there's not a developer on board for that scheme yet. And Gladman, the landowner for that site, have given us some detail in terms of their anticipated trajectory for the site. So we've based it on that. So we're still still trying to be realistic based on the information we've got for sites, and that lead in from the granting of permission to starting to build out. So I think realistic is probably a good term to use for estimates.
Okay, I suppose I'm trying to look ahead and what the trajectory shows. You haven't got a graph. I mean, some trajectories include a graph with them, don't they? And you can then see perhaps more clearly. But if I were to add up leaving aside individual sites, but if you added up the bottom line figures in the trajectory in Appendix A, or the updated version of it, you can go in 5 years blocks. You could roll it forward each year, couldn't you? You've put figures in at every period, but you can just move along each year, couldn't you? So if you added up the 5-year supply, say from 2022 rather than from 2021, 5 years from 2022 to 2027, you can get a figure for that. And equally from 23 to 28, you can get a figure. I think my reading of it is, I've not actually done all the sums, is that those figures would actually get a bit bigger.
Yes, yeah, they do as those larger sites come online.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the trajectory there, it's split into 5-year sections as well, to give you an idea for each 5-year period. Yeah, but I haven't got a running.
No.
Yeah, a running total. I thought that might confuse things a bit.
Well, it probably would confuse things.
But I understand what you mean. Yeah, so yeah. But I think it's because of those larger sites coming, getting their permission and starting to build out, particularly the ones where there's multiple outlets. It's looking quite healthy towards the end of that first 5-year period. For 3 or 4 years, doesn't it? Looks quite. The figures are quite high in that period. Yeah.
So. Someone will tell me. So if it was a different view about that, they'll tell. Right. Is there anything else you want to say about the 5-year supply as against the requirement in terms of consistency with national policy?
Not in great detail, sir, but just to say that we've obviously we've accorded with the guidance and tried to provide clear and robust evidence for those sites that are required to evidence them within the 5-year supply, and we feel like we've done that within Appendix 1 to our Matter 4 statement, where all the details are set out.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, let's see if anyone's disagreeing about the 5-year supply and the requirement. Mr. Hall.
Thank you, sir. It was just to make the link with the non-implementation allowance that I raised earlier, if you like, the discount. So we're quite keen just to make sure that whatever figures get reported at least reflect that, or that, you know, what the impact would be were you to apply it, at least, because on the higher target, which we've argued for, with that discount, it's not quite such a generous cushion, is it? If I followed the thread of all the figures you were both throwing around, it brings it down. Well, effectively, you were saying 1,670 commitments. If you applied a 10% discount, that does knock 167 off. If it was 8%, obviously it's a slightly lower figure.
Yeah.
So that does get you down then, because I think there was a figure of nearly 200, wasn't there? 18 something mentioned, 190, but you would be knocking 160 odd off that. So it's tight, but they have one. I'm not saying they don't have one. And I accept that a number of sites have been held back. So, but what is important to my client is the next few years. It is tight. We know there's some bigger sites coming along. If you like, the oil tankers are going to arrive, but not just yet.
No, but I mean, I don't know if you've looked at the trajectory in detail, but I think, isn't it true that each year after this one, if you added up the 5-year blocks, they start increasing each time? So
I would certainly agree each 5-year period gets better for the life of these big sites. Yeah. But I mean, it just depends on every lead in time and if they can crack on and approve permissions soon after this, when the plan's adopted, because they have this interim, what should we call it, embargo or hiatus, where it's waiting for the adoption of or your report, certainly, adoption of the plan. That was all. It's not, it's a decent supply, but it's not quite so much over 5 as being made out, I don't think.
No. Yeah, understood. Yeah, understood. So it's helpful to point that out, so that if you did apply a lapse rate to the commitments, whilst I could, you can look at the various figures for the overall supply for the plan period, including what's available beyond 2036, but could come forward earlier. I think if you applied a lapse rate, it would make it wouldn't make a huge difference to that, in the sense of because of the generous, But in terms of looking at the immediate 5-year supply and how it potentially could be more significant.
It's 5 point something is really what I'm saying. I'd have to go. Well, I can do the maths and put it in a note, but but if you've got a live proposal at the moment, that's quite important, because what to be frank, you wouldn't want the authority saying, well, we've got a massive oversupply at the moment, because they haven't. That's the point. It's been, in the absence of the local plan, a lot of it's been planning by appeal or hold things up. I appreciate some things got the nod, but some of the appeals were successful. That's the context, but we're getting there. The plan-led system's the way forward. The rest of what you said, I'm not dissenting from.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. No, even on the council's figures and not applying a lapse rate to them, it's quite tight, in the sense that there's only a surplus over the 5-year requirement based on higher figures. It would only take 1 or 2 of the sites to stall or whatever, as you say. And so if you apply the lapse rate, you're getting back down to almost just getting there to the supply. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Any other comments about the 5-year requirement, 5-year supply that anyone wishes to make? No. Okay. Right, we'll crack on. It is 4:15. I've just got the policy H1 really to deal with now, and then I briefly just want to check on the small sites and custom and self-build, just to make sure there's not any comments about that. So policy H1. I know there's some people who have participants today who have sat patiently, because I think this was possibly the bit of the discussion they wanted to contribute to. So thank you for your patience. But anyway, policy H1 includes a policy approach that we've already mentioned it earlier on, I think, but I just wanted to check if there's any further views about this, which allows for the release of non-allocated sites if the circumstance arose where the council was unable to demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing land in the borough as required by the NPPF. And my preamble to the question 4.21 incorrectly referred to the 8 rural villages being in that. It isn't. It's the development limits just of the main urban area and the 3 service villages. So apologies for that. So don't get distracted by the rural villages. So really the only question I had about this was whether it's clear what the policy means in 2 respects. It says at any point in the local plan period where there is no longer a demonstrable supply of sites to meet the 5-year requirement, sustainable housing sites is a phrase that's used. It's whether the meaning of that what does that mean? Is it a word that just leads to discussion and debate that isn't needed? Is it just sites? And it says located beyond development limits. Well, does that mean anywhere beyond the development limits, or is it this combination of it being sustainable and beyond? It's clarity. Is it clear enough? I think is the question on that. There's the clause about making a positive contribution as well. I don't know if someone picked this up or not. In the sense is what does that meant to mean? Because presumably any planning permission, provided it was going to be delivered in the next few years, would make a positive contribution. So I think they're the three questions I had about it. I know there are some other points that others have made about, well, you could apply this policy even irrespective of whether there's a 5-year supply. It's not my question about it, but anyway, I'll let people have a say in a minute. But could the council respond to those 3 points about the clarity, about the reference to sustainable sites being beyond, but well related to development limits and making a positive contribution?
Thank you, sir. Yes, yes, that fallback position in policy H1 was to provide some flexibility if we came into that situation of not having a 5-year supply, and providing developers and with some more guidance if we were in that situation. I think I take your points in terms of the clarity. Maybe it could be improved in places, but I think in general we were just wanting to ensure that these sites were in sustainable locations adjacent to the settlements which we considered to be the most sustainable in the plan, and linked in with the settlement hierarchy, which is the main urban area and service villages. And it's an approach that we have seen taken in other approved and adopted local plans, and it is an approach that we took in our core strategy as well, so it's carrying that forward. But I think it's important to note that yes, it does say located beyond development limits, but the final part of that sentence says well related to them. So it does give a bit of guidance. I think we wouldn't want them to be what's the term, in a remote location. Like, there would still have to be in a good proximity to those settlements.
But you just used the word adjacent, but that's not in there. I mean, is that if I'm not saying it should be adjacent, that's not what it says. So
yeah, but I think we were trying to. It doesn't have to be right next to the development limits. It's given a little bit of flexibility there as well. But I understand what you're saying about interpreting that, and it would be a development management judgment. So yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not necessarily saying that the council's got to change this. I'm just exploring whether it's. I mean, you're saying it's deliberately flexible. I mean, I think I've seen other policies a bit like this that actually say adjacent, and then some would say, well, that's a bit arbitrary, isn't it? Because there could be a reason why there's a bit of land that's not actually quite adjacent, but you know,
yes, exactly,
it's well related. So I can see the advantage of this. It's just whether it's
trying not to be too prescriptive.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of the positive contribution, what's that getting at then?
I think it's in terms of if you said you had a scheme of just potentially a small number of dwellings, like 1 or 2 dwellings, that wouldn't necessarily make a substantial contribution to the 5-year supply.
Well, it would make a positive contribution, though.
It would make a contribution, but it maybe wouldn't. Yeah, it would still make a contribution, yes. But I think we were just trying to get at that. You might end up with sort of small pockets of schemes that maybe don't help boost the supply as much. That was kind of the thought behind that. But I can see how it's maybe not totally clear.
I thought that what it meant was I disagree with that. I think if it says positive, I think one house is a positive contribution. If you want it to be a substantial contribution on any site, well, that would be different. And you're getting into, if you're saying, but I thought it might mean that, well, you'd want some assurance that it was going to be built fairly quickly, because otherwise it wouldn't be contribute. You don't want to be giving permission for sites that are just going to be sat on that won't be built in years.
And I think sorry, so yeah, and I think like we've been proactive in that in the past and implementing shorter timescales for permissions when we haven't got a 5-year supply. But obviously that's not something that's written into the policy. But yes, we have been doing that.
Right. Okay. Well,
I think there's just another point, so that when we've had a number of appeals related to 5-year supply issues where there have been for a small number of dwellings, inspectors have said they don't actually make a great contribution to 5-year supply, and there's obviously the material planning considerations, but in the overall that benefit to the supply doesn't outweigh the negatives of the scheme. So that was kind of the thought process behind it as well.
Okay, I'm just reading now, paragraph 6.2.6 actually deals with this. It says that the council will may reduce implementation or submission of reserved matters timescales to ensure delivery takes place within 5 years. And if an application is granted in this situation, subsequently expires, it will not necessarily be reviewed automatically. That's in the reason justification. So I suppose that does explain what the positive contribution is.
Sorry, which
paragraph 6.2.6.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does just provide some additional explanation.
Yeah, so that's about ensuring that the site will actually deliver within 5 years, and then say that necessarily imposing conditions. So it's not about the scale of it. Okay, well, yeah, right. Let's see if anyone's got any views about this. Right, Mr. Ridgen.
Hello, sir. How are you doing? Just in relation to the development limits and looking at the proposals map that was updated and sent round, obviously the development limits go around the allocations as well. Thinking about this sort of clearly written and unambiguous, I'm presuming that the council wouldn't want to see development happening outside of that sort of allocation until that had been built out. So I think there's some ambiguity in that. Thinking about Darlington itself, and you've got the A66 running round to the east and south, and the A1 to the west, and then you've got the allocations to the north. There isn't a lot of opportunity in some respects around that. So very much looking at those service villages, which obviously I know you don't want to talk about emission sites, but where the opportunities could arise. I know the council also said yesterday that there was nothing in principle stopping development and happening in those service villages as well. I think that in the representations I've made, not just to this matter but other matters, a sort of criteria-based approach would be more appropriate and give a bit more certainty as to what would be appropriate and where. And I think in terms of amendments to policy H1 to make it sound, I think that sort of criteria approach would be more suitable.
So I mean, there are criteria, aren't there? But they're quite short. I mean, they're well related to. Doesn't say anything about scale. I mean, Fiona McCall mentioned what the positive contribution might be something about scale, but actually I don't think it is. But that maybe that's ambiguous. So really, the only real criteria is that it's well related to the development limit. And actually, I think, as you're saying, well, actually, it's not the relationship to the development limit that matters. It's the relationship to the built form that matters.
Correct. I'm just thinking about the recently adopted Durham local plan, which you'll obviously know well. So there was a list of criteria included in both policy 6 and policy 11 of that plan, and that sort of criteria approach I think would be suitable in this plan as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Moss.
Thank you, sir. I too made reference to policy 6 when I was last on session a couple of weeks back, and think that would have merit. Moving on, I think my issue with the paragraph in policy SH1 at as currently worded, is just a limitation that the approach only applies in the main urban area and the service villages. It should additionally, in my view, apply in the rural villages. They can be sustainable locations for new development coming forward. And I'm thinking, for example, of a site recently built in Neasham, which I've referenced in the plan. You've got the pub, the village hall, the village green, etc., etc. There's no reason why sites cannot and should not come forward in the villages to contribute towards the total. And I think we've got another item on the agenda for a bit later, which is in relation to small sites. And I'm conscious in the council's statement, they did make a comment about, I think it's 7% is the figure I've got in mind, of sites are going to be small in the sense intended. My client site has been built out. This supply that came from the interim housing policy of 2016 is now being exhausted. So there's an interface there with the amount of small sites that are going to come forward in the future with the additional constraints of this plan policy approach.
Okay, yeah, understood. We'll get the council to respond to that. I think that we might have touched on it earlier, but right, okay. I mean, I suppose in that sense, if it depends what the policy is. At the moment, it just has to be well related to development limits. But I mean, if it had to be well related in terms of scale and location to the settlement, and it's a small settlement, it would ensure it would build some safeguards in terms of you wouldn't be getting big housing developments on the edge of a rural village just because it's one-time development. Yeah.
It's got to be appropriate, but small schemes can go in well. And the one I'm thinking about was 10 dwellings.
Yeah.
There could be other small examples.
Yeah, and in some ways, if you're trying to boost your 5-year supply, it's an efficient way to do it is a larger number of small sites rather than trying to rely on bigger sites. So having positive contribution can be made by a 1 or 2 or 3 or less than 10 housing developments, so long as. Yeah.
I mean, the facts in that one, planning permission or outline planning permission was granted in the summer of 2017. Reserve matters was made by a small builder, different from the major, the following year, and the last of the dwellings was completed last summer. So, from the grant of planning permission to houses completed, 10 dwellings in 3 years, and a small site and a small builder.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Good example. Right, Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much. I wanted to, shall we say, take a slightly non-planning interpretation of the word making a positive contribution. I understood it to mean making a positive environmental and social contribution to the development where it was being constructed. So things like having a significantly higher level of insulation than the minimum requirement, meeting specific local housing needs that otherwise wouldn't be met in the village, presumably, or around the edge of Darlington. Any particular low carbon transport based or low car based sites, and also that it should have a good relationship to the existing development and might include or allow the provision of services that otherwise couldn't otherwise be provided. And I just wanted to throw that into the mix. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Right, and Richard Cohn.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just listening to what's been said here, I'm really wondering what making a positive contribution does mean in this at all, because it is a positive contribution to the 5-year supply. We've been discussing for some time, or you've been discussing for some time, the nature of the 5-year supply, and it certainly seems that this is perfectly adequate at the moment. So it almost seems superfluous if there is a 5-year supply, that particular criterion doesn't really come into play. Perhaps it should say something, makes a contribution to the 5-year supply if it is wanting, or words to that effect. But as you have indicated, one house makes a positive contribution to the 5-year supply, whether the 5-year supply is met or not. Sir, I would also like to say, I find myself perhaps surprisingly in some agreement with Mr. Bridgen over the criteria that may be wanted for well related. I have seen one or two applications under the Durham Plan in respect policy 6 and well related, where should we say I have not felt in full agreement with the council as to what well related means. And if it is left as vague as this, I think it is so elastic that anything can be well related. I appreciate it is to the larger areas, the urban development of the service villages. If it was to be extended to smaller villages, you know, if we looked at Hortonley Side or something like that and said it's well related to Hortonley Side, what is well related to a place like that? I think that some criteria should be given to give some meaning or some guidance as to what well related means. And I think the Durham Plan would be a useful benchmark for working on that.
Okay, thank you for that. Right. Okay, any other comments? Do you want to turn your camera off, Mr. Cohen? Thanks. Okay, right. Let's go. Any final comments from the council? I think the point made by Mr. Ridgeon in particular about being well related to development limits is possibly a bit. I think it's about relationship with the built form, and I think I don't want to. I think the action point here is just to think about whether this policy could be clarified in the sense of what it is intending to achieve in terms of the nature of the development, the sort of location it may be appropriate in, and whether anything about scale, what the positive contribution expectation is. I think it's clear enough from the reason justification actually that it's going to actually be built, not just be sat on. Any further comments from the council or
not specifically, sir. I think we can have a think about that as well. We can see that there is a bit of clarity issue, but I take Mr. Ridgeon's point about you could have a site north of Skirningham where there is a green buffer, but I think that's where the planning judgment comes in, and a DM officer would have to look at the policy and say, well, is that well related? It's well related to development limits, but it's not well related to the built form. And I think maybe we need to have a little bit of a think about that.
I think maybe it is the built form, isn't it, which could change it. Given that the development limits go around, large parts of the urban area, the development limits are outside allocations that aren't yet built. So I mean, clearly, I think it has to be related to the built form rather than the development limit itself. That may be sufficient. I don't know. I mean, people are referring to other plans, the Durham Plan in particular, about other criteria you could use. You could have a think about that. You're saying you deliberately want a bit of flexibility. You don't want to be tied to adjacent, and I can understand that. And I'm not saying that's unsound. I think it's just a bit of clarity, really. And so I'll leave that with you if we could.
Yes, we can have a think about that. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So finally, I had two questions actually about small and medium-sized sites, which the NPPF is clear that they can make an important contribution to meeting housing requirements, and the expectation that the plan, along with the council's brownfield land register, so it's not the plan itself, it's those two things together, should identify land to accommodate at least 10% of the housing requirement in sites of no larger than 1 hectare. And the plan's policy should also reflect the needs of people wishing to commission or build their own homes. So my two questions were about whether it's effective in that regard. The council's statement in response to the 10% or not, it says that there is that the completions since 2016, the commitments and the windfall allowance do add up to more than 10% of the 984 requirement. But you don't actually, I don't think you actually provide a figure, so I don't know what it is. Could you tell me what that is?
Sorry, sir, I didn't realise we were actually talking about this item today.
No,
so I have not quite prepared with the figures. But yes, just as set out in our statement to matter 4, we outline how obviously the plan preparation started a number of years ago, and there was a number of small and medium-sized sites, more of those in the plan at the beginning of preparation, and as time's moved on, a number of these sites have gained planning permission, and commenced and built out. So unfortunately, our supply is below that 10% when you look at in terms of sites going forward. But if you took into account our completed sites as well, we would meet that 10% requirement. But it's also important to note that the figures in our the percentages don't account for the additional sites we included in the trajectory yesterday. There's potentially a couple that would contribute to that small sites below 1 hectare in there too. And also, like you say, it's meant to also include sites within our brownfield land register. I believe there's a couple of sites in there that would meet the criteria. They're sort of linked to the town centre fringe area, and obviously the council would be supportive of those coming forward. And I think our evidence has shown smaller sites coming through the system. So I think we're quite confident that although it doesn't appear that we are maybe meeting the 10% in terms of sites from the April 2021 going forward, we have over the plan period, and we'll continue to try and encourage and boost that supply through other means as well.
Yeah, okay, understood. It's, I think, unless I missed something in your statement, it's just that you say that there's more than 10%, but you don't actually provide what the percentage is or what the total figure is, I don't think, in the statement, unless I missed something. But it doesn't matter now.
Possibly not. I could provide those figures though, sir, if you...
Yeah, I'll have a think. And also, I think, unless someone says otherwise, I don't think the NPPF prevents you from adding in the completion since 2016, because that's your requirement from 2016. So I think, you know, if they've been built out, I think that's reasonable. So I'm not taking issue with that either. And anything in the brownfield register that's additional to what's assumed in the plan, again, that's legitimate to add in, because that's what the NPPF says. So I think maybe, I don't want to make a big thing of this, I think for the sake of my, it's one of these explicit national policy requirements that I'm meant to sort of ensure that is covered off. So I might, if you could just provide a short note, I'll do an action point on it, but just a short note just to clarify what that supply is, including the completions since 2016.
Yes, of course, sir.
Any other comments or points about that? Councillor Holroyd.
Thank you very much, sir. I just wanted to add whether it would be possible to allocate some areas on the large sites, because obviously often it will be a large developer that applies for the planning permission, but then it's built out by different developers, and I don't know in planning terms whether that would count as being a small site if it was a small subset of a larger site, but certainly it would be good if the larger sites were required to provide some areas for self-build and that element of the requirement. But yeah, if it's allowed to provide this 10% of homes on a smaller site, if it could be like a smaller subset, I don't know.
Oh no, thank you for that. It reminds me, it was another question I was going to ask. It's the other element is the first question rather than the numerical question about the 10%. It was about whether the plan will be effective in ensuring that there's sufficient land for people wishing to commission or build their own homes, so self-build and custom build. I don't know, is there anything in the plan that refers to that? Does policy H4, housing mix, or any other policy deal with that? Someone for the council?
I say yes. I believe there's a reference to custom and self-build in H4, just in terms of the council will encourage and support the delivery of custom and self-build. Monitor the demand for that and try to assist with delivery where we can. And I believe there's references to it in H10 and H11 in terms of the Skirningham and Faverdale allocations and encouraging that type of development there. As set out in our statement, our self-build register doesn't evidence a significant demand for that type of plot or development, so it didn't seem substantial enough to allocate sites for custom and self-build.
Okay, I think looking at your statement, it says there were 46 registrations by the end of 2020, but only 3 were on part 1. What does that mean?
It's the register split in 2. and the reason being on those on part 1, the council is required by the regulations to link them up with a suitable plot for self-build within a certain time period. I believe it might be 3 years from the point at which they're added to the register. So there's a requirement and a necessity on the council to help to link them up with sites. So I think it's particularly that part 1 which shows, I mean, obviously 46 registrations as well on the part overall. That's not a great number, but particularly on the part 3 where people are, I think there's sort of local criteria and eligibility as well. They have to pay a fee to be on part 1 and be local. So it shows that the demand isn't significant on that register. So hence the approach we've taken. But the council are proactive in terms of trying to encourage and support that, and we have been in discussions on the larger sites at Skirningham and Faverdale to look at that type of development. And as I mentioned, it's written into the policy, and obviously the council will meet the requirements of the self and custom build regulations in terms of linking up those wanting to self-build with permission plots, and I believe we have done that recently with a site at near Tandridge Court in the borough, where the council are looking to dispose of that land, and we are looking to potentially link that up with a person who was on part 1 of the register. So we are active in trying to help with that and assist with that delivery.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Stedker.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just wanted to come in on that self-build and service plot point there, and the question would be how positively encouraging the council has been, because there doesn't seem to have been plots coming forward, and I suppose it is chicken and egg. So I do have a sympathy with council officers in this regard. I'm familiar with the site just mentioned. It's only a few hundred metres from where I live. I happen to be on the register, but I think when the charge was introduced, there may have been a fall off of people wanting to be on part 1. So that may have been a suppression in people being interested. And the latest email I received about on this planning policy, you sort of listed opportunities for converting a house into 2 flats and 2 apartments, or a conversion of an office into flats, and they are unlikely to be appealing to people wanting to self-build. So I would say that I think that the council could do better, or this plan could do better, and the idea from my fellow councillor of allocating areas on larger sites that would be for self-builders. We've seen this happen in other parts of the country, I believe, where like a self-build corner or a self-build street brings sort of economies of scale to a certain degree, or encouragement of scale to self-build, and maybe will fulfil one of a type of need of housing that currently this plan doesn't support, I don't think, strongly enough.
I'm looking at policy H10 now, what it actually says. It says the site will provide a mix of housing types, tenures and sizes, including affordable and self-custom built housing. So it's a fairly clear requirement, really, for Skirningham site. Okay, I can reflect on that. Joe Richardson.
Hello, sir. I would agree with the comments made by councillors, and the site that I'm promoting, we put forward as a self-build plot, and I think we got the same, and the council's already mentioned it today, in terms of not wanting to progress things until the plan was in place. But I think the wording of the policy doesn't allow for sites on the edge of the built environment to come forward for custom and self-build. So I think in terms of a positive plan approach, I think that there is more that can be done.
Sorry, did you say that the policy does allow for sites on the edge of development limits to come forward for self-build or not?
No, I said it doesn't.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't appear to me. No.
I think it should. Is the point I'm making, sir?
Yeah, understood. Yeah.
And I think in terms of the bigger sites, in terms of policy H10 and H11, we've obviously got a lot of infrastructure and difficulties in terms of other things that they need to provide. It can be more difficult to provide areas on those smaller sites rather than the more standard volume house building product.
Okay, thank you. Right, any other comments about custom and self-build? No? Any other things that people wish to? I don't want to go back over things we've dealt with, but if there's any major point that someone's which didn't have the opportunity to make at the appropriate time, perhaps you could say now. Any other final comments from the council? No? Okay.
No further comments, no, sir.
No, okay, thank you.
Thank you, thanks.
Right, okay, I think what we'll do then is, I don't think there's any particular thing I need to go through now. I'll go through my notes and see if and set out some action points. There's a limited number of action points I identified. I think the council hopefully has kept a record as well, so we can tally those up. So that deals with the overall housing supply situation in terms of the various allocations, commitments, etc. So we will move on tomorrow morning to look at other aspects of housing policy in the plan. Just to clarify that there has been a revised agenda published, I think, for revised agendas published for tomorrow. So we're dealing with what was always the case in the morning, to do with the various policies relating to aspects of housing delivery, different affordable housing needs and other requirements such as that. I've also moved the session that I'm going to have about the gypsy and traveller policy to have hopefully deal with in the morning, because I think there should be time for that. If not, I'll just have to rearrange that for another time. So that frees up the afternoon to deal with Skirningham again. As I said, it's just really to pick up some further questions I may have on reflection of having been, going through the day that we had yesterday on that. It's not an opportunity to go back over the same things again. It's to pick up any sort of further things I just need clarification on, and there's the potential revision to policy H10 that the council's going to be tabling and hopefully publishing today. And there's the contribution to the 5-year supply, which I know I've already come to an end of that generally, but I mean, we just need to talk about that in relation to the Skirningham and then next week on the Faverdale sites. So unless there's any questions or comments about that, we'll finish. I know, Mr. Cohen, you've got your hand up. Is it a procedural point you wish to make or a question?
It is for tomorrow, sir.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, Mr. Harrison, I think it was, made some comments on the comments that I had made, which I felt I would have liked to have come back on, but obviously there wasn't time yesterday. In view of what you've said, will there be an opportunity to do that tomorrow?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely, yeah. I mean, if there's sort of issues that we didn't quite get to the end of, that's fine, because the discussion went round and we had to kind of finish it because we got to the end. So I think the way, if it had naturally run its course, you may want to put your hand up and we might have continued that. So yes, so I think that's fair enough, to pick up on certain things that were sort of raised towards the end. That's absolutely fine. So, but I don't want to just sort of people to think, well, we're going to start the agenda at the beginning again and go through the whole thing again.
I accept that, sir. I would purely be limiting myself to probably points of clarification, not in view of what he said.
Yeah, that's fine. I know also Judith Murray, who's representing the Windfield residents, unfortunately is unable to attend again tomorrow, but she has sent to Liz some sort of points that she may have made yesterday or issues that she may wish to raise. So I will look at those. She's put those in an email. I'm not accepting further representations as such, but they're in the nature of things that if she had been able to attend tomorrow, she would have raised. So I will bring those up. And the invitation's been sent, I think, to everyone that was participating yesterday. So hope those that are able to attend again will be able to do that. I guess there were one or two people who participated yesterday and were hoping to talk about Elm Tree Farm that didn't participate today, either because they weren't on the list or they weren't able to. I don't know. So I suppose in the interest of fairness, we've discussed Elm Tree Farm today, but I suppose in the interest of fairness, if anyone who's participating tomorrow wishes to make any further points about Elm Tree Farm. I mean, I know Mr. Clark had raised some issues about it in terms of access and a couple of other matters. I will give those an opportunity to do that as well. Okay, so unless there's anything else that anybody wishes to clarify before we finish, I will end this session now, and we'll be back again at 9:30 tomorrow. So thank you.